Last time, we read the longest chapter in Genesis and got through a big, that's one of my kids, and got through a big section of, I don't know why they made it that long. No other chapter is that long. It doesn't need to be that long. There's just no point. Because there are no chapters and verses in the Hebrew Bible. That's why. And so someone along the line decided, oh, here's a good place to put a chunk and make it a chapter. Thanks, Septuagint. That's the Greek Old Testament. Yeah, and I don't think I need to say much more. Other than we talked about the fact that there are details along the way that we're learning that are indications that these stories were edited way later in time than they're supposed to have occurred. Okay, like the introduction of camels into Abraham's riches. That's just not possible. Okay, and so sometimes they'll use modernized terms, and we would do the same thing. You know, we would say he was rich in gold, and it might not be gold. It might be like silver, or we might just call it money. You know, and it might be something like that's actual silver, or bronze might have been money, or they might have had clay money, and it's not like our paper money. So it's not exactly the same thing anyways, and so we're going to do it. We're going to contextualize it. When we say rich, we typically mean monetarily. When they said rich, they typically meant with things like family and livestock. Okay? And what's cool about that is that's one of those kinds of richness that is self-propagating. Because you have enough kids and animals, eventually you're full, like you got a lot. Because they're just going to start breeding. You know, and it just boom, 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 boom. And so that's how you look at prosperity in the Hebrew Bible anyways. Yeah, I don't have any camels yet, but I got the kids. I don't know where we're going to put a camel. We don't have a yard. Yeah. Anyways, so that's kind of where we are, and we're now 25 chapters into Genesis, and we've still yet to meet any character called Satan or the devil. So you'd think if that was like an important thing for people to know about, it would be in there, like in the beginning. And it's not. Okay, anyways. So we're in Genesis 25 now. And it says, Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. And we've just learned that Sarah has basically just died. And Abraham's like, all right, on to the next. And so that's kind of weird. Although I think the word for wife here, I'm going to look it up real quick, I think is actually more like concubine. No, it's wife. I'm done. I was wrong. But anyways, so what's going on here? Why is Abraham taking another wife? And what we're about to read is one of these generation lists, and we've encountered these a lot, and a lot of this is very boring unless you're a history person. If you're a history person, there's a lot of really fun stuff in here. And all I'll say is if you're really into history, get Nahum Sarna's Genesis commentary from the JPS series. Because especially with these name lists, he does a really good job of showing you where these are, what they're saying about the people groups that we know existed in the ancient Near East. And so for this one, it's basically saying that what they know about all the people groups around them, most of them anyways, came through Abraham in some way. And we're about to learn how. Okay, so we already know about the Ishmaelites who came from Abraham and Hagar. And we know about Israel, but also some others that we're going to learn about today, who come through the line of Isaac and Jacob. And then we're about to learn about some more people who come through Keturah. Okay, and this other one came through, Isaac and Jacob come through Sarah, obviously. So Keturah, she bore him Zimron, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shuah. And I don't know how many of you are familiar enough with the Bible that Midian struck you. Okay, and one of the easiest ones to talk about there is that in Exodus, Moses goes out into the wilderness of Midian, and his father-in-law is a priest of Yahweh in Midian. How the heck did Yahweh get there? Oh, wait, Abraham is his father. So there's this whole Yahweh tradition that we don't have any writings from that existed outside of what we know Israel did with their version of Yahweh. And usually it's the victor that writes the story. And so just because Israel's story is the one that we have does not mean necessarily that it's the one that's like right. It just is the one that we have because they won. At least in the literary idea, they won. Because their book is still here and no one else's is. And so there's some other and this is kind of a tripping point for some people when they're reading through in the English Bible and they're like, wait, how is this guy who is outside of the Hebrew community in Egypt, all the way out in Midian, a priest of Yahweh before there are priests? Because there's no Levitical or Exodus priesthood yet when Moses goes to him. So there's obviously something else going on. There's a whole other Yahweh tradition in this area of Midian, and this is that the way that the biblical authors will introduce tribal confederations is to make them sons of some patriarch. This doesn't necessarily mean that they were actually his children. Keturah is a Hebrew word that's closely related to the word for spices, and so what they think is that this is the federation of spice traders that they knew about, and a lot of these names do match up with that. So this is one of those hey, here's how we read the Bible. Abraham doesn't have to be the sperm and egg father of all of these people for them to link them to him as the patriarch of the area. Just how it works. Jokshan was the father of Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Asherim, Letishim, and Leumim, and they don't know who any of those are. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abidah, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah. That's interesting information. Not really. It's interesting if you read Sarna's commentary, because he does go into detail on just about every name in this list. And it's if you're a history person, get it, because it's just worth it to read. It's good. And then he also has all these things at the end of the commentary that are essays on topics that come up throughout. So he's got an essay on the binding of Isaac, and he's got an essay on, this kind of stuff. So, okay, so then we have this verse that says, Abraham gave all he had to Isaac. So just in case there's any confusion as to which of Abraham's children deserve what's there property-wise, it's made clear. He gave it all to Isaac. All these other kids, sorry. And this happened. Okay, so this isn't abnormal. It's not abnormal in the ancient Near East at all for a younger son to end up with the birthright. So the story of Jacob and Esau that we're about to read is not an abnormal thing. Okay? But to the sons of his concubines, so I said earlier she was called a wife, but now it's clarified, okay, so she's a concubine. So she's not actually married, even though we've yet to find any kind of marriage ceremony that's other than sex in a tent. So maybe the concubines, you go to a hotel or something. But you'll notice, this all is also contextualized as the command, thou shalt not commit adultery. This is totally okay, and it goes on being okay after the Ten Commandments to have multiple wives. So when we think about monogamy in the American post-Victorian moral sense, we're not thinking about marriage as they would have in the ancient Near East. Okay, there's some things that go on with all that. So, and that's all I'm going to say for now until we get there. No, it's actually kind of instructional for how they viewed things. And when people want to do silly things like talk about modern sexuality through the lens of ancient sex laws, that's one of the first ones you got to go to with them. Thou shalt not commit adultery permitted a man to marry multiple women or not. He could just have concubines and it was totally fine. That wasn't adultery. So do we want to frame our sexual laws by theirs? Probably not. So, but to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts while he was still living, and he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. Now, while he was still living is a very important phrase because it means Isaac didn't swoop in after daddy's death and take something that wasn't his. Okay? Dad gave it to him before he died. And I think that's probably a legitimate, most of this story has little pieces of historical factuality thrown in, amid what we would call mythical nature of it at times. And so we don't dismiss or accept everything whole cloth. You have to go through it and, what Paul would call rightly dividing is take it apart and look at what they're actually saying. And then he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. And again, that just kind of outlines where these tribes are and where they appeared, the ones that they know of, and that's accurate. They actually were east. And so this is kind of one of those, hey, here's how those people got there stories. We've heard this already with Philistines. Here's how they got here. They came from the sea. And then it says, this is the length of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. There's two interesting things here. This is the only person in the Bible who gets that phrase, that breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years. And what it means is not only did he die very, very old, but he was totally satisfied when he died, and that he had no wants left. And so, but it's important because it's the only time that's said, and this is the reward, really, for believing God. It's not even like Abraham didn't do everything right. He lies. He essentially gives his wife away to other men to save his own butt. He does some pretty crazy things. He disowns a baby and leaves him to die in the wilderness, or a kid anyways. And so there's a lot there that he does that isn't necessarily morally right, but he believes God. That doesn't mean he believes in God. Okay, that's not even an option for the biblical characters. There's no such thing as atheism in the ancient world. Okay? And so it's do you believe God or not? That's are you faithful to God means do you believe God, not or do you believe in? And Abraham believed God. God said, hey, if you'll do this, I'll do this. And Abraham said, okay. And that's the sum total of his righteousness, is that he said, okay. And that's not okay, you can come live in my heart. God of the universe that permeates every cell of everything, I give you permission to do something. No, I believe what you said. And literally with Abraham, there was something said. Okay, this isn't we don't need to romanticize everything that's in the Bible to be about us and say, I believe what you said when you said this over, if we're going to say we believe what God says over us, then you got to hear it and believe it, and that's good. If I heard the audible voice of God and I didn't believe it, there's a problem. You put it that way. I'm not saying you have to hear the audible voice of God. I'm just saying this is what this is about. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. After the death of Abraham, God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac settled at Beer Lahai Roi. Okay, so this is interesting because Ishmael comes back. And he's been gone, right? He's been in a different place, and he comes back to actually bury his father. So obviously there's no bad blood there between Isaac and Ishmael. They're able to do this thing together, and maybe he just was okay, there, it's over, and he goes back to his land, and that's that. And then again, they make the point that Abraham purchased this field, that this wasn't a military incursion that happened, that there wasn't, he bought it. He didn't come settle there. He didn't homestead. He didn't steal it from somebody. He didn't use his band of military and raid it and kill and rape and pillage, and he purchased it. And it's his. And he has every right to do what he wants there now. And so his entrance into the promised land was with a purchase. And then it says, after the death of Abraham, God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac settled at Beer Lahai Roi. So there's this double blessing going on where Abraham's already given him the blessing, and then God does it too. And then we get another one of these. These are the descendants of. And everybody knows now, because we've had enough of these, that when you see this is a priestly editor like sticking that into the story because, hey, this fits here. And a lot of these lists are probably lists that they had like in archives. And so as a means of preserving national identity and history and all that, they stick their Toledot lists into the stories where they seem to fit. Okay, and so it kind of is this, it's the editor tipping his hat, basically, like, hey, I'm here too. You know, it's not just the author, but I'm also here, and I'm sticking something here to let you know that I'm here. It says, these are the descendants of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's slave girl, bore to Abraham. There's a lot of qualifiers there. They don't usually like qualify people they have a high amount of respect for. These are the names of the son of Ishmael, named in the order of their birth. Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, and Kedar, Abdeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jeter, Naphish, and Kedemah. Right? There's a lot of people there. A lot of them that you don't know that are actually ancient Arab tribes. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names, by their villages and by their encampments, 12 princes according to their tribes. This is the length of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. He breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. Now, that's the second time we've heard that phrase. The first one was of Abraham, right? And Sarna notes actually that this kind of gives away the fact that ancient Israel believed in an afterlife. And a lot of scholars say, oh, no, they didn't. And the phrase gathered to his people can be taken a couple different ways. Sometimes it means they gathered his bones up with the family bones and put them all in a family ossuary. But what it really kind of means is that he went on, to be in this place where his family has already gone. And they don't know what it is. They don't know what to call it. They don't have a word for it. It's just he was gathered to his people. And so this happens with Ishmael. And so that means that Ishmael, who's not the child of promise, gets gathered to Abraham because that's his people. Guess who? And so there are some things here that are kind of giving away, I think, what I like to call inspiration is it kicks back at prejudices and exclusions that we've formed, and all of the known Arabic descendants and Muslim descendants of Ishmael and all of the tribes that come from this line are going to be gathered to their people. And that's kind of how you have to look at it, at least at what this story is saying. Okay, and what you do with that in your own Christian eschatology, I don't really care, but you can't ignore what's going on here. These were not covenant people that were still gathered to their fathers. Okay, I've made that clear. 12 princes, that word just really means kind of rulers or leaders. They didn't have a name for like chiefs back then. This is the length of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. He breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. They settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria. He settled down alongside all of his people. Now, these are the descendants of Isaac, Abraham's son. Now, these aren't logically connected, even though they're both Abraham's children. So these would most likely just be separate lists that they had that came through different tribal traditions, I guess is the word. Because a lot of this stuff is oral tradition that comes from various tribes. Anybody that's ever done any work with Native American spirituality and history, or South American spirituality and history, and how they work with the known past and the unknown past, it's very, very similar in how they do all this. So these are the descendants of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean. Obviously, Laban's important because he gets put in here, and usually they don't do that. Like, oh, and by the way, here's the brother too. So this guy is important to the story. Notice that Isaac's been around for 40 years, and we don't even know much about him yet. He's not really doing much. He's kind of just... I guess if you live to be 175, though, 40 is like 18, so he's probably just at home playing video games. It's like nothing to report. He has acne. He's mad at me again. He's hungry. Kid sleeps all the time. He's 35, I know. I can't wait till he's 40 and moves out of the house. That's what my parents said, uh-oh. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. Notice what this assumes is that God is the cause of barrenness. In the ancient Near East, God was always the cause of barrenness. And it wasn't that God was doing anything to harm the woman. It was that God was withholding fecundity, is the word that they would use. The ability to reproduce was being withheld by God. And so anytime a child, that's why all kids are a blessing from the Lord in the Bible. Conception is always God's direct involvement, okay, for their worldview. It doesn't happen without him. I like that. And remember what we've said, that when we form our theologies, all we do is we go through and pick out the stuff we like and throw away the rest. That was kind of a joke. Even though that is what we do. The Lord granted his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. The children struggled together within her. So immediately, it doesn't say she conceived twins, and then immediately it's like, well, bam, she has two. So Isaac's prayer is effective. And I'm sure something else was effective. And she said, if it is to be this way, why do I live? How many of you have ever had children inside you and said that phrase? There were times when Gabby said that laying on the bed, like, ah! So she went to inquire of the Lord. Okay, does it say that she prayed? No, she goes somewhere and goes and talks to Yahweh. So he's somewhere. He's not everywhere, he's somewhere. He's not an ethereal spirit, he's someone you can talk to. So she goes and talks to Yahweh, and she says, well, she doesn't, he says, the Lord says to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. And we know who this is. This is Jacob and Esau. And the nations that come from them are Israel and Edom. And Edom in the Bible is Israel's enemy at one point, later on. And so here what we have is, whenever you have 2 cultures that are enemies, if what their origin story says that they were initially brothers of the same, they probably were. They're not going to say that about someone who's they're not really related to. They hate the Edomites later in their later history. And so the fact that this is allowed to stay, it means it's probably true. Okay, so we have some historical and there's other outside documents that actually kind of say the same thing and verify some of this. And then, interesting here, the Hebrew syntax for the phrase, the elder shall serve the younger, can be kind of Yoda-esque, and it could be something like, the elder, the younger shall serve. And so it's not clear there, that translation is biased for Israel. But it's actually not clear in the Hebrew what it means. If it means that it's the elder will serve the younger, or that the younger will serve the older. And that's just the way Hebrew works, and you got to get over it. It's unclear. Historically speaking, we know that Edom did serve Israel, and so there's kind of that in there too. So they translate it that way because that's what happened sometimes. But it doesn't, there should be a good footnote there that says, or the elder, the younger shall serve. And some Bibles will have that footnote. Not all of them do. When her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. Oh, that's why. That's why I don't want to live. There's 2 full-size babies. The first came out, all his body like a hairy, or the first came out red, all his body like a hairy mantle. So they named him Esau. Esau doesn't mean hairy or red. Anyways, afterward his brother came out with his hand gripping Esau's heel, so his name was Jacob. How many of you have heard that, Jacob means deceiver? That's wrong. It means heel. And it doesn't mean heel grabber. Ekev is the Hebrew word for heel. And Yaakov is just kind of a name version of that. And so it's just because that's what he was doing. Grabbing a heel. Doesn't mean that he's a heel biter. He's deceptive. No, that's not what this is about. Because when we get to this story, he really doesn't do much deceiving. Okay, most of the people around him are just really, really dumb. I'm serious. We're going to see some real stupidity from some people who are supposed to be wise. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them, and the boys grew. So it's been another 20 years have passed in a matter of about 15 verses. We've talked about this before. There's a lot of time telescoping that goes on in the Bible, and we need to not think that it's all even in a line. Sometimes we're leapfrogging over some things and then coming back, and then it's oh, and by the way, Moses got drunk after he planted a vineyard and harvested the grapes and matured the wine, and that happens in a verse. 30 years of time. If it's good wine. I mean, maybe he made crappy wine and it was 2-3 years, but still, it's a good amount of time compressed into one verse. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field. And usually what this means is when they do this kind of time telescoping, we know there's a legendary character to the story. Because we do this with our own folk tales. You bypass 20, 30 years at a time to tell parts of the story that matter. Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man living in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game. What? He's a skillful hunter, and so Isaac loves him because he's fond of game. I wonder what that's foreshadowing. But Rebekah loved Jacob. So does it say that Rebekah hates Esau? No. She could just as well read Rebekah also loved Jacob. Okay, so it's not one parent had one favorite and the other parent had one favorite, and the parents didn't like each other, and so they pitted the kids against each other. That's like a divorced American couple. And these guys are still married, and they live in the same tent, so that's not what's going on. And then you get this cool little phrase that ought to let you know, again, that we're moving on to another story that came from another tribe, probably, that is probably also very legendary. Once, when Jacob was cooking a stew, that's once upon a time, Esau came in from the field, and he was famished. Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff, for I am famished." Therefore he was called Edom. What? He wants to eat, so he's called Edom? No. The Hebrew word for red is Edom. But he says, "Give me some of that red stuff." And in the Hebrew it says, ha-adam, ha-adam, which is Adam is the word for man. Is he cooking human, or what's going on? But also dam is the word for blood, which is red. So there's a whole lot of play going on here, and Edom is just a vowel change, because DM are the consonants there. And we've learned that in Hebrew the words are consonants, and the vowels are kind of how you change the words. So all these are related to redness. And so he wants this red stew, and so they call him Red. Okay. There's why he's called Edom later on, folks. Wasn't that exciting? He wants some of that red stuff. He doesn't know what it is yet. He's walked into the tent, and he can see from over here it's red. In ancient culture, they thought that blood broth granted you vitality, and he says, "I'm famished." So there's something there. Maybe he thought that Isaac was making a blood stew. He's a hunter. That's not unheard of. Jacob said, "First sell me your birthright." Esau said, "I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" And this is not him being "I'm so hungry, I'm going to starve to death." This is him saying, what I do for a living is very dangerous, and I'm probably going to die before you. I'm about to die. One translation says, "I am at death's doorstep." And he's out in a field hunting gazelle with lions that also hunt gazelle. And there are, according to later stuff, there's bears too. It's dangerous to be a hunter in the ancient world. And aside from that, can you imagine how big some of the animals got because they weren't overhunted? There's probably some massively, things that you would normally eat that could kill you. And you're hunting with, spears that are wooden and maybe have a stone tip and, maybe a bow, but not a bow like we have, compound bows. Maybe 15 yards, most. It's a dangerous thing. So he's not being dramatic. He's just saying, look, there's no use for me to have a birthright. So what does this do? This kind of like removes Jacob from being, Jacob's just a deceiver. Israel stole the birthright. No, they didn't. And no, he didn't. His brother is actually just kind of acknowledging what's probably going to happen. He's like, I know the way of the world. I'm a hunter, and you live in a tent. It's just naturally safer for you. Jacob said, swear to me first. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Can you imagine an oath being all you need to seal a contract in today's culture? He said, hearsay is not admissible in a court of law. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew. It's not blood. It's lentils. There's a lot of protein in lentils, so that's good. And Egyptian lentils are red. So that kind of tells you their, at least, culinary background. If not where they're being influenced by culturally, kingdom-wise. And Esau, he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. So one of the things that happens here in the Hebrew is you don't get this in English because we have to put in multiple words for one Hebrew word. So, and he ate is one word, and drank is one word, and rose. And these are all, and he ate, and he drank, and he rose, and he went his way. And those are all one word. And what that's meant to say is he basically just screwed the pooch, is kind of what they're saying with the abruptness of the language there. And so there's no like additions to the story. It's just, and so he did this, and he did this, and he did this, and he despised his inheritance. And it's just kind of how they like get in the initial dig for Edom, who we're going to learn about later, is constantly giving them problems. And they do it with Canaan in the story of Noah. Cursed be Canaan. Why? It wasn't like Canaan didn't do anything to his grandmother or to his grandfather. Why you got to curse the kid? Oh. Well, because later on they're going to fight those people, but that's why. But so in the next chapter, and I think this is brilliant editorial work, because this whole story of Jacob and Esau like culminates with Esau giving Jacob the birthright over food, for food. And then the very next chapter, now there was a famine in the land. And I think this is brilliant editorial work. It's like not necessarily connected linear timeline-wise, but it's connected story-wise. And you get what they're doing, and they're telling story about their origins, right? And the more you see that this is a big origin story that's playing out in Genesis, the more you start to realize when it's written and why it's written and for what purposes, that they're making certain editorial moves. And all of this is, there are some conservative scholars who still say things like, and we're going to be out of here early today, by the way, who say things like, these stories they're very, very old, and there's proof that these are ancient writings, and it's like, well, not really. The oldest stuff we have is after the exile, the oldest writing, and the Babylonian exile frames a massive amount of Genesis. In the way that they do, the language, the mythology, the way that the entire thing is structured as a play against Babylonian gods. And then it moves to Canaanite gods and deities, and then it moves to Egyptian gods and deities in Exodus. And then Leviticus moves to desert deities and demons. And then Numbers goes back into Canaanite, and then Deuteronomy does Canaanite, and then all of a sudden you have Joshua. And so you've had all this theological polemic going on for 5 books that are supposedly thousands of years old, but are interplaying with cults that we know about from like way later. And they're still telling these old stories, though. And so it's, once you start to see how they're playing it against, and we're going to, especially when we get to Leviticus later on, I know everybody's like, yawn, but when we get there, and you start playing Leviticus against the desert cults, and you see the kinds of things that they're doing and how they're upsetting sacrifice in the ancient Near East, it's actually, it's interesting, okay? I mean, does that mean, do we have to follow everything in Leviticus? No. You don't live in the promised land. You're not Jewish. Those are qualifiers for Leviticus to apply to you, by the way. You have to be Jewish and live in the promised land. You can't, if you live in America, Leviticus doesn't apply to you anyways. Right? So that's just silly. And then aside from that, the whole book starts with, hey, when you sacrifice. It's not like, and so God commanded them, you shall sacrifice, and this is how you shall do it. It's like, no, you're a sacrificial people, and we'll deal with that later. So when you do that, here's how I want you to do it. You can't just go ape shit and kill everything in sight. You have to, only certain animals are okay. You can't kill people. I mean, that's wildly different than other cultures. Human sacrifice was totally accepted and encouraged in most ancient societies, especially child sacrifice. And Yahweh's all about being against that. Never did it enter my mind. And he disowns them for putting their children through the flames to Molech. He's like, what is wrong with you? Absolutely. And so there are things about the sacrificial code, and people are like, oh, God couldn't have commanded the sacrifices. And it's like, well, however you want to process your philosophical notions of what God can and can't do, I don't care. The biblical text says that what God said was, when you do this, here's how I want it done. Okay. So at some point we got to learn to be gracious to ancient cultures for being ancient cultures. And we shouldn't expect, just because they're biblical, we shouldn't expect them to be different than the world around them. They're Middle Eastern people. They're not white people. They're not European of any kind. They have a completely different culture and way of viewing life. They have a completely different view of the world, and cosmology is different. In the Dead Sea Genesis Apocryphon, this is closer to Jesus, the Dead Sea Scrolls are. But they have kind of a view of the world that Shem, Ham, and Japheth were kind of given the world. And Shem is the Semitic people, and Ham went down into Africa, and Japheth went up into Europe. And so this is kind of how, and their boundaries of the world are very small. They don't even include all of Africa or any of the Orient or most of Europe. And this is what they knew the world to be. This was the extent of their world. And I'm sure some of the tribes at the reaches knew of things beyond them. But it only went so far, right? It's like a big Venn diagram, of overlapping. Well, we know about these people, and we know, but we don't have any knowledge of them. And so it's not like our modern world, right? We can go on Google and we can look at a map and we can say, well, that's stupid. That's not south of there. They didn't, how do they know what's north, south, east, and west, son? That's about it. What if it's nighttime? What if it's noon? What if the sun's standing still for 3 days? How do you know which way you're going? I think, you get landmarks. But anyways, I digress. Okay, so next time we're going to get more into, I want to just look real quick. Yeah, this is where we're going to get into the chapter where Isaac does the same thing that his dad did and lies about his wife and almost has her taken by another man. Idiot. You think Abraham would have told him? Yeah. Hey, so one time, me and your mom were walking through Egypt. I didn't hear that. But one thing that's cool about Isaac is he's the only monogamous patriarch. He's only got Rebekah. That's it. And he loved her. And he was all about her. And then he gave her to the Egyptian king. Anyways. Well, you're dismissed early. You can hang out and visit. Or you can go if you're anxious to go. May's like, I'm ready to